I'll introduce the panel. Jenny Hewitt. Jenny Hewitt, first of all, is the National Affairs Correspondent for The Australian. She has been now for 4 years, and she specialises in major business and political issues. Barry Dunstan, and that's Barry with an IE, and that's important. Barry is Associate Editor of the Financial Review, and he's been writing on superannuation and fund management issues now for 24 years. Annette Sampson. Annette Sampson is a personal finance editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and she's written extensively on finance for publications here and overseas for a very long time. And from the ABC stable, Cheryl Bagwell. Cheryl is a commentator and broadcaster with 25 years' experience, and she is now the business editor with Fran Kelly's ABC program on Radio National. Gerard mentioned that Bill Shorten is, in fact, he's at an ERC meeting in Canberra as we speak, so no doubt Wayne Swan is telling him and the other ministers that they'll have no money to spend in the budget and they have to start lowering their expectations, but of course they remain big picture politicians just the same. I was in Canberra late last week and I just tried to get a sense of some of the thinking, though, that I thought I could pass on to you before he gets here late in the day. One of the things they did say to me, that they are aware of some views within the industry that somehow this issue, the 12% issue, has slipped down the pecking order just a bit. The message to the audience today is that they are as enthusiastic as ever, that they do want this to happen. But then, as always, you get the but. And the but is that any reform in this area is subject to the vagaries of the Parliament. In that video that we just saw, it was suggested that it was thrown as into the political mix. It was made a political issue, and it is. It is a political decision to link the two, but nevertheless, it's the reality. And I think that's what you're going to have to deal with. The comment from them about that is that if the mining tax was to go down, they would profoundly regret it for a range of reasons, that being one of them. But I think it's slightly troubling that when you often hear ministers talk about the mining tax and they say it needs to get up because the government wants to spend money on infrastructure and they want to spend money on lowering the company tax rate, they don't always link the superannuation issue with that. It's just an observation of mine. Also on this question of whether the offsetting wages in order to allow this to go ahead, it's interesting that Bill Shorten's office says that he has a slightly more sophisticated view of that. Well, I'd be anxious to hear what that is later on in the day, because he's had this extensive background in the trade union movement. So we'll see what that is, but they will be running the argument, and they've run it before, on this, that it's just an observation, but I think it's meant to have some impact with the trade unions and others, is that a wage increase can be inflationary, and they argue that doing it this way is not necessarily so. And the final message that they did want to pass on, and I'm sure you're going to hear more of this later on today, is that the government wants to see the industry united on this issue, and they want to see the industry to be far more active than they believe the industry has been up until now. So we might start on that first point. And Annette, is that a fair criticism on the government's part? Is that a concern you think worth raising, that maybe the industry itself, Kath Botel there in the video said that it's in the pages of the Fin Review and not on page one of the Herald Sun? Well, it's not going to be, but should the industry be doing more?
Look, definitely. I think to date the industry hasn't been terribly vocal about this. In part, I think, because the miners were so vocal, so I guess the superannuation industry really held back a little bit, or you didn't get the sense that they were out actively campaigning for that 12%. And I guess the other point is, particularly this industry has a way, when it comes out, of looking at championing its own interests. And people are very cynical about that if they see that, okay, look, this is all about getting more money in so we can earn more fees. So I think the super industry really needs to be promoting the entire package, and really how that will benefit the mums and dads and ordinary people out there.
There's a lot of competition out there, though, at the moment, Jenny, on issues, and the media and the government is focusing on the big issues like the mining tax and the tax on carbon.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think one of the issues here, it's not going to be, particularly surprising to people in this audience, but, superannuation for many people still remains a bit of a mystery. They know it's important, they kind of like the idea of superannuation, but they really don't understand how it all fits together. And they also know that there seems to be lots of changes and things that go on all the time that they don't quite get. So I do think it's going to be a very big political issue for the government. I think the idea that they will be linking it to the mining tax, again, the super industry has a bit of a mixed view on this. I mean, you've got a lot of the retail funds, of course, don't want it mixed. Everyone can agree on the fact that they want it to go from 9% to 12%. But there's a lot of disquiet in some parts of the industry about this link to the mining tax. So I think that's going to be kind of quite difficult politics, and I agree with one of the speakers in the video. Until you make it real to people about what it actually means for individuals, I think it's going to continue to be in the background a bit. Having said that, I think Shorten and in particular the government in general, know this is one of the reforms, for a government that's trying to establish and having a bit of trouble establishing reform credentials, know this will be a very good long-term reform that they would be remembered for. So they will be very, very reluctant to put that down the agenda.
Cheryl?
I'm kind of interested in that, because why isn't the government speaking up more about it? Bill Shorten is, but when it comes to just last week when the mining tax was moved that extra step, we had Wayne Swan and Martin Ferguson on the program to discuss it. Not once did they refer to the link with superannuation. They talked about this is going to turbocharge infrastructure spending. They might have mentioned the company tax cut, but super wasn't there. And I'm kind of curious as to what the industry thinks. I mean, I know the industry is a bit worried about that lack of speaking up for this particular reform on the part of government. Now, we could say the reason, there's probably, maybe we shouldn't read too much into it, but I'd say maybe they don't want to provoke yet another stoush with business. Small business, as you know, are very much opposed to the left. Maybe it's just because they know that in surveys there's broad community support for super, even if they don't understand it, and even if they have been watching their super returns diminish this year. But the worst case scenario might be is that they're keeping the door open to drop it if they find, as many people seem to be worried about, that the revenue that will flow from the mining tax may not be enough to fund this particular reform, and given that the government says it's very much committed to returning the budget to surplus.
Yeah, what do you think about that last point, Barry? Because that's you'd have to say that there is some doubt now about what the mining tax will deliver. Yeah. We know what it won't deliver. About $60 billion has been foregone, but we don't quite know what it will deliver.
No, and it'd be lovely to know what would happen in China and what the commodity price trend is going to be. Just so we're open-ended. But there are questions there. But I think the industry's biggest problem is that it's got all those members who are, by and large, disengaged. You couldn't get a rally of superannuation fund members like you got in Canberra last week, I suspect. The survey that was done just the other day reported that only half the members actually were aware that of the proposal to increase the SG to 12%. Now, the AIST said, well, we think that's a good result, but gee, it's not a very good response for someone who's, the members who are being promised or being offered, extra in their pocket.
Oh, I think, that's part of this problem here, that nobody's quite sure who's going to pay for it. They like the idea. Now, I think the minister's tried to emphasise in various speeches that it'll be kind of paid for out of wages rather than by employers, but he obviously has to be a bit careful how he does that, and which is why I think you're getting this point about it'll be less inflationary, therefore interest rates won't go up in the same way, but people will still get the benefits. Now, that argument, I think, at the moment is actually getting, I think they're making it, but it's having trouble getting a bit of traction because there is these other issues, are so much more volatile, whether it's the mining tax, but now, of course, the carbon tax. And so much of the government's attention and political energy will be focused towards that. And so an argument on superannuation, while incredibly important, is regarded, I guess, as just a little bit more nuanced, and so than this, full-on aggressive assault that's going on the carbon tax. So I think that's why it's a bit quieter, rather than any lack of intention on their part.
And do they actually have to go back to the basics in terms of, does the community really need to be persuaded of the concept itself? That is, that if there's going to be more discretionary income, why should they be compelled to save it rather than pay off the mortgage or whatever? Is there a need to go right back to the basics, or do you think it's accepted that in the community that it's a good thing?
I don't think you need to go right back to the idea of persuading people that compulsory super is a good thing. Pretty much every survey I've seen, people like that idea. They know they're not going to do it themselves. You can offer all the incentives you like, but your average person isn't going to put aside that money for retirement. And so people really are warm and fuzzy about the idea that the government's doing something for them. I think where it gets problematic is in this idea of how much, getting people more aware of their super. And I know the industry's always said, oh look, once your account balance gets over 50 or 100,000, people will become more engaged. But I think what the industry really needs to be doing is talking about retirement and your goals for retirement and what sort of lifestyle you like going to live, and bringing that right back to what 9% super means, what 12% super means, maybe even what the differences between the two would mean for someone.
Sure.
I'm just going to say, I know I personally, I'm really engaged in my super account, particularly in the last couple of years, and I think that is a bit of a problem, is that the GFC, I mean, in this country didn't destroy jobs, but it certainly destroyed wealth. And I think that's when people did sort of lock on to my super. I thought I would be able to retire in comfort, and realise that, hey, it's not. Now, that's a good thing in terms of engaging people, but on the other hand, it could be a problem in terms of selling. You know, what's the point of increasing even further when I'd just rather take that money now and pay off the mortgage? I mean, the latest APRA statistics don't tell a great story over the last decade. Hasn't been a great decade for super returns. I think they're just keeping up with inflation or not even. I can see why a lot of people would say, just let me, put the money into property or something like that. And I don't know how much of an issue that's going to be if there is a campaign about super. People will start asking those questions, like, why is this one? This is the best way to save for our retirement. And within the Labor Party too, there's a lot of concern about going this route entirely. I mean, there's a lot of groundswell in Cabinet Room about, tax concessions through super. Is that the best way? Not to help lower income earners. It's seen as some people call it a rort even. I mean, that helps the more wealthy but does little for the low income worker. Of course, these reforms include aiming at that, but there is a kind of groundswell within Labor too about that the tax concessions are actually costing more than what the age pension would cost us in the end. I don't know if that's correct. The super experts could tell me that, but I think that's also an issue that needs to be kind of dispelled.
Yeah, there is this idea that if you get everyone saving through compulsory super, the government's going to save a fortune on the age pension. And all the predictions really show that that's not going to be the case for at least 20 years or even longer. Most people are still going to be partly dependent on the pension. All it's doing is giving people a slightly better quality of lifestyle in retirement. But I think that's really something that we need to be grappling with.
It says 20 years or so before that kicks in. Is that equally the debate about drawdown as against the lump sum? I mean, how many years away before that can be a realistic argument until the lump sum becomes large enough that you can talk about it in terms of a drawdown giving you a regular income?
Well, it's for the average fund member, and I suspect the trouble with many of the newspapers when they write about super, they're writing about the high-end super, where there's an expectation there's 500,000 more going to be there. For most people, it's going to be a fair while before they're going to be staring at $100,000 in their account. And the other fact, the other problem the industry's always got is that Australians have just got a love affair with property and with their own home, and they'll do anything to pay off their mortgage. In the survey I just mentioned, I think the lowest percentage, more people thought it was a good idea to pay off the mortgage and put money into superannuation than any other question they were asked. The mortgage is important for most people.
And so when Kath Botel again made that point that it's, some people have trouble already with the concept that you're saying that this amount of money must come out of your salary into superannuation, and now you're telling them, or you might be at some point telling them, this is how we want you to spend it as well.
Yeah, I think that's also why, you know, this whole kind of concept of post-retirement planning has been put off again into the too hard basket. They're trying to get, you know, these reforms through, and that's going to be difficult enough. But in the end, I mean, for this system to actually work effectively for people, you are going to have to deal with that. Because as Barry said, you know, you get a small kind of lump sum. Most people get a small lump sum. That sounds good, but it actually doesn't help government finances very much, and it also doesn't help people, you know, in their longer-term retirement. But I think at the moment, one of the issues has been that the industry itself has not come up with some very good answers or responses in that direction. And, you know, there are all sorts of problems with annuities. They can be expensive, they're difficult, they're not particularly attractive to people. So I also think the industry has to come up with some more creative ways of doing it, but understand it will be, you know, a very long-term thing. And I do kind of come back to this point that even when you go to 12% by 2019, that is a very good thing. But I think people still have a kind of many people have a, you know, misguided idea that they've been contributing to super. So when they do retire, actually there'll be plenty there. And they're all going to, as all the baby boomers start to retire, they're all going to get very, very agitated about the fact that it's not the case.
Mm. And Cheryl, we've talked about the community attitudes towards it. What about business? How difficult is it going to be to persuade business of this, and particularly small business?
Well, small business, whenever I ring them up, says how much they hate the idea. They don't believe that the lift in the SG will be accompanied with trade-off in terms of wage increases. I guess, I don't know whether that's because Bill Shorten is in charge and therefore, you know, he's got suspicions about the trade union movement. There's certainly, the trade unions are saying that they're not absolutely going to give up bargaining for wage increases if they get the SG. So, but business, of course, says, small business in particular, says they just simply can't afford it. But big business, though, is kind of relatively muted. I mean, mostly because big business, big companies already pay, if they're good companies, pay above 9% anyway. But, you know, the fact that on this particular front, I mean, people really, broadly speaking, support the idea of employers putting more money into their super. I think the government's in a better position with this one than they are on, say, the carbon tax. I think there's broad support for the mining tax as well, but yeah, we'll just have to see how that's particularly goes.
And when Bill Shorten says that there may be other ways of going about this other than just straight out wages offset, what could he possibly be talking about there?
Well, I think that's where you kind of get to that whole sensitivity about interest rates. And really effectively what they're trying to argue that if everybody gets just wage increases, that will lead to inflation, that will have an effect on interest rates. But that is, you know, and that is a very valid argument. I think it's going to be, you know, difficult to sell, particularly to small business, as Cheryl mentioned. The other issue is that you don't have, you know, when we had this whole thing kind of come in initially, you know, the whole idea of, we had a much bigger trade union kind of centralised system, and this has now changed. So I think that will also become, you know, a little bit more difficult. But, you know, in the end, I think common sense will prevail, and the fact that this is a good idea is obvious, will become obvious to most people, even if they try and shift the cost.
Just one other thing, I think the government, they could have got small business on board in a better way if the company tax cut that they offered at the end, I mean, it's been watered down with the mining tax. It's just one percentage point. I mean, it's nothing. I think they could have really got business wholesale on board if it was actually connected with a much deeper company tax cut.
It was initially 2%, wasn't it?
Yes, under the original super profits tax, but that kind of went with the super profits tax.
But a lot of small businesses aren't incorporated, so they don't get the benefit of that anyway.
That's true.
You need a bigger tax cut than that to make some small businesses happy, because, you know, they've hated superannuation from the outset, and to be paying it to those terrible industry funds too, that makes it even worse.
But under the decentralised system now, though, the point that Jenny was talking about, how do you manage that? How do you do that, cut those sorts of deals these days, given the nature of the wages setting system?
I don't know. Bill Shorten, I think, he's also got a big problem. He's got to talk all the employers into getting themselves electronically organised so they can lodge contributions electronically. Because SuperStream's not going to work unless that happens. And he says they're all sensible people. They'll make that decision.
What we've also got to remember
Let's hope so.
is that we're talking about bringing in this 3% over something like 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's not until 2018 that you're going to get the 3%. And I would have thought most employees would be hoping for a bit bigger wage increase in those years up to 2018 than 3%. So we're really talking about partial wage trade-offs, not giving it up entirely. And that message seems to have got lost a little bit in all the...
And it's not just looking at it from that point of view either that it's not a large cost because it's incremental. The cost on the government is something like $240 million, I think, in the first year, and then it might be something like $6 billion towards the end of it. Does that make it any easier for them? Again, it comes back to the question of how much will they get from the mining tax. But
so in the scheme of things, it's pretty small bickies, isn't it? In $1 trillion sort of budget, you know, it's no big deal. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about whether the mining tax gets up and gets through, because they have absolutely said, the one thing that Wayne Swan has said is that if that doesn't get up, neither does the super. So the conversation, I guess, has to be a little bit about, you know, whether we think that's going to happen. It looks like it's going to happen, given that the government has caved in to the big miners, and they've agreed to reimburse them for future state royalties as well as current. The Greens don't like that, but I don't get any... I mean, I think at the end of the day that they will come to the party and they will support the mining tax, because it's better, you know, Bob Brown has virtually said as much, it's better to have a light tax on the miners than none at all in their view. So it will probably get up, but who knows in this particular political environment whether the government can even last the next 2 years. And then after an election, of course, the opposition, if they were to win the next election, have vowed to repeal not only the mining tax but the carbon tax.
I think there's a lot of political bluff in this on all sides, frankly. I think the mining tax will probably get up, but certainly there's no guarantees on it, because it's not just Bob Brown, it's all the other Greens who are kind of difficult. But I think the linking between the mining tax and the superannuation guarantee was always a bit of nonsense anyway. I mean, as Cheryl said, I mean, in the context of a you know, such a huge budget, it's kind of ridiculous. It's just that they wanted to do it to make it appear more attractive. So I don't think actually that's the crucial thing. But I do think it's going to be very hard for the government to try and manage the mining tax. But I think also for the Liberals, if the superannuation guarantee was in place, if it is actually legislated this year, which I think it actually still has a strong chance of being, no matter what happens to the mining tax, I think that would be much harder to rescind, because, you know, for all the reasons we talked about, people do like the idea, and it would be very, very complicated. So I think I'm much more optimistic about this happening, although we come back to this point that, you know, in itself, it's actually not adequate.
yeah.
Isn't it not coming into it's not meant to come until 2013? Is that right? The first
That's when it starts.
Yeah, it'll start.
So
Yeah.
is that after the next election?
Well, I think that'll be drowned out by all the other arguments at the next election.
Yeah, and I take it, I think there is a lot of bluff and bluster about it. You look at the progress of Parliament so far, more than 70 bills have gone through, none of them have gone down. Just last week, a lot of the attention was taken away by events outside of Parliament House, but during that week, the flood levy went through, the childcare rebate payments were paid fortnightly rather than every 3 months. That went through. There was NBN-related legislation went through. So I think in the end, the Greens would be more likely to say on this, and you say that they would take the light touch. They will take something rather than nothing. They'll take a different view to the carbon tax, because something rather than nothing sits more awkwardly with them. But I think on this, that's probably what they would do. But the royalties issue with the states, Annette, how difficult is that for the government to iron out?
It just raises more questions of how much money they finally end up with, which is why, really, if we're going to talk about 12% being a certainty, the funding can't be necessarily reliant on the mining tax. I mean, what does the government do if it doesn't get enough money from the mining tax? Say, OK, we stop here at 10.5%. You just can't do that. There are just so many uncertainties.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I mean, it mightn't get as much, it's true, but we're supposedly in this commodities boom that we've never seen the likes of before. Commodity prices are going up 50%, you know, year on year. I think, you know, even the Conservative projections from the watered-down mining tax is still about $40 billion or something like that, even though, you know, 60 has gone out the window by lowering the tax rate and also just applying it to a couple of commodities. But you know, again, it is a furphy, really. I mean, the money is there. And it is interesting why they decided to link it with the mining tax. I think it was around that time, we were talking about May last year. I mean, it was about putting forward the image of the government, of the Labor government, as economically prudent and returning the budget to surplus, and that everything had to be funded. You know,
I think they also hoped that it would make the mining tax an easier sell. It didn't work out
Absolutely.
that way, but, yeah.
Well, then you could get back to where we started, that the super industry didn't really come in behind them on that one, or didn't appear to. Perhaps.
Oh, well, look, I think that the original resource super's profits tax was such a fiasco that nobody could have sold it. It wouldn't have mattered what the super industry did, you know, so I don't think we can blame them for that at all.
Yeah.
And well, similarly, I think with the royalties issue with the states, there's absolutely no way the government can figure this out. They've been messing around, trying to figure out what to do, and this is all just pretense that they've got some answer in some way to actually deal with the states. They don't.
And I want to talk about the carbon tax and how you think that'll all play out, and in the extension of that is what might happen at when we next go to an election. But just more broadly on the wider reforms on efficiency and transparency and so on. And what have you got to say about that? How important is it that the industry finds a way to have a united view on this, and what concepts are effectively dead?
Look, this is something of a bit of a bugbear, because when the government came out with the 12%, it was quite clear that it wasn't giving the industry a free ride. In return for getting this reform that you've always wanted, it wanted the industry to become cleaner, more efficient, more transparent, and really clean up a lot of the dirtier practices in the super and financial advice industry. Since then, we've now seen pretty much your traditional splits in the industry, with some arguing, yes, let's go the full way with those reforms, and other groups really wanting to cherry pick out the good bits and keep other bits and not have those implemented. So I think there is that whole issue of the industry really needing to decide whether or not it can get together and agree on those reforms. I think that's going to be a really hard ask given the traditional splits within the industry. But for your average person out there, they don't like seeing super funds fighting with one another and nagging at one another all the time. They really want to know that these people are operating in their interests. The alternative really sets it up that people believe that they're all after their own profits and don't really care about their members.
I think the one of the more important things that's happening now, Barry, though, is that all the consultations involving the government, Treasury, APRA, ASIC, there's a lot of, thumping of, pushing together of people in crowded rooms, as Gerard said. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and there's a lot of people who are in the industry who are, working pretty hard on that, and they're being cajoled and pushed, and particularly by Treasury and the bureaucrats. The government want to get this done, and I wouldn't be pessimistic about the chances of the industry achieving this, because I think they're going to be pushed pretty hard.
Okay, we'll talk about the carbon tax now, because this is critical as well. The industry, of course, is investing a lot of money already. They've made judgments on this, and they're investing in climate solutions and so on. And so there's a lot at stake in terms of returns for everybody. But there are two big questions. Will the carbon tax get through? And if it does, will the government survive? And if it doesn't, where are we? Back to square one. Who wants to start there? Cheryl?
Oh my God. A lot of ifs there. Well, I don't think, there's no going back for Julia Gillard on this. It has brought down, two opposition leaders and one Prime Minister. I don't think she's going to be the second one to go back. So they're committed to it. And as far as we can tell at this stage, the crossbenchers are kind of on side. I think Tony Windsor has sort of said that he supports this hybrid scheme of a fixed price moving into a floating price. Remember, even Rob Oakeshott might be a bit concerned after what happened over the weekend in New South Wales, but even he was a backer of emissions trading at the time. So, if they can make it through, it's still 2 years to the next election, if they can make it that far. And of course, that depends on support continuing from the crossbenchers. It does raise the issue, though. It's a completely, we talk about certainty in this particular issue, that business needs certainty. As Jenny was saying before, when we were talking earlier. I mean, this is the most uncertain sort of environment because even after the election, if the opposition were to win, of course, that is one thing they say they will repeal. So it's a completely uncertain environment, regardless of what you think about the merits of a carbon tax, it could go any way at this point. It's so volatile.
Anything else on that?
Well, I think it's going to be very, very hard for the government to get this through. I think Cheryl's right that they will definitely, they're going to have to do that or, you know, die trying. They may get it through. I think it's still going to be very hard to sell to the electorate because the fights are just beginning about compensation and things like that. Interestingly, a lot of, as you would know, obviously a lot of big business is quite supportive of the idea. A lot of it is not. But the ones who are not supportive are the ones who are, you know, small business and all those households and all those marginal electorates which are very dangerous for the government. So I think this is going to be a very tough battle for them. And then coming back to this point about, you know, why there isn't more attention on super, to me, the problem with it is it's not going to provide certainty for those reasons, but we're still going to have an electorate that is very concerned about, you know, price increases of electricity, things like that. And I don't think it's going to actually solve those issues. And in the meantime, other issues that I consider to be very important, like super, will kind of slip down. They won't slip down off the agenda, but they will not be part of the public debate in the same way that I absolutely think they should be.
But there's no prospect of certainty about anything until we have another election, because the outcome is it could go either way. The polls are still as tight as they were at the time of the last election. For me, I've always signed up to the idea that this parliament go its full term because it was in the interest of the independents. They're relevant right now, and they lose their relevance because after the next election, presumably, one of the major parties will win with a majority. But it might have with Rob Oakeshott, if it hadn't already occurred to him. I think at the weekend it's probably occurred to him now. It's not so much about relevance anymore, it's about survival. And he's got no chance, absolutely none, of winning his seat at the next election as it stands. So I'd be keeping a close eye on him because if he wanted to make that ultimate gesture towards the coalition and bring about an election, he might do it on this issue. I know, Cheryl, I take your point that he's on the record as being a supporter of an ETS, but so is Malcolm Turnbull, John Howard, Joe Hockey.
Yeah, it's one issue that they go back on. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what the New South Wales, the massive defeat of Labor in New South Wales will have on federal Labor. I mean, obviously Tony Abbott is making a lot of the fact that Barry O'Farrell campaigned on the carbon tax and to a lesser extent the mining tax, because mining is still quite big in New South Wales. And whether that will undermine now with this big vote, whether that undermines the reform agenda of federal Labor. I mean, how much the carbon tax played in the New South Wales election, I mean, it's impossible to say. I think it played little, you know, in it myself because, New South Wales voters were going to vote out this government, the Labor government, way before the carbon tax was on the agenda. I think perhaps why people voted out Labor was because they couldn't get to work on time, you know, because the public transport had been run down, and they might have even, you could equally argue, they might have even voted for Barry O'Farrell in spite of his rejection of the carbon tax. And on the positive side for Labor, if they can see any positives, I mean, you know, it's a big story now. The onus will be on Barry O'Farrell to deliver very shortly. And for Labor, for federal Labor, they can at least say, at last we have the scandal-ridden New South Wales Labor monkey off our back. You know, they've been consigned to history. Yeah, so that could, you know, give them some...
I take your point that I don't think it was a big issue in the state election, but there is only one way of creating any certainty on this issue, and that is to have an election at the federal level. And that will, there will be certainty after that because it will be a referendum on this issue. It'll be far and away the biggest issue in the campaign.
Like it could have been last time.
But it will be if you get a majority government beyond the next election, and then once and for all the issue will be settled. But it can't be in the meantime.
No, I don't think it can be in the meantime, and you know that's why I just think this is a very big. I understand why Julia thinks she did, but I actually think this has been probably a big political error on her part, and I think it's going to just sap energy from the government. I don't think there will be any. What they say is that this will mean there'll be lots. There'll be more certainty for the electricity industry, and there'll be more certainty in power investment and generation and stuff. Well, that's not going to happen. It's absolutely not going to happen.
The political reality is that the Greens are there from July. They will have the balance of power in the Senate. I mean, that's the political reality she faced, and they wanted to push that issue. It's not like, yes, of course they went back on an issue, on the issue, which side hasn't. But it's an issue that was Labor Party policy in the first place. At least they haven't done a complete about turn. So I think I have some sympathy for them in the sense that it was a new political reality after the election, and they had to form alliances, and that's part of the deal, whether you like it or not. That's part of the deal.
All right, we'll have to go to questions in a moment because we're running out of time, and we'll alternate, I think, between the text messages, and we'll take some questions from the floor. But just before we do, Barry, just to sum up on investment outlooks, and I know looking at figures like this is a bit like looking at climate change. You look at over the last 40 years, you look at the last 10 years or whatever when you're making judgments about how well the industry's going. But what would you say as a general comment?
Well, we've had 10 average years. We've had 20, 25 years pretty good. I think most investment people seem to say our returns in the next decade or so are going to be lower, and they're going to be volatile too, which really cheers you up. I think the other problem is that in the last few years, and particularly since the GFC, the whole question of investing all the superannuation money has really come under a big question mark. Are the old ways of allocating the money right, or should we be using another method? And no one has made that decision yet, or no one knows. And you either look at the rear vision mirror and allocate according to what happened in the past, or you sort of look through the windscreen and then you're starting to guess what's going to happen. I think the industry is going to, how well it does is going to depend on whether it gets that balance right, whether they do in fact do this sort of dynamic investing, or whether they're stuck in the past.
And there's also that issue of the emphasis in the wake of the Cooper review on fees, and that's, I suppose, made many people and trustees and things very conscious of low fee environment and the need for that. Now even a lot of the industry funds are trying to say, oh well, actually we really mean net returns. We've got to focus on net returns rather than just fees, which of course they do. And I think there is a danger that the focus on fees can get you to the lowest common denominator approach if you're not careful.
Well, the final question for me to probably coming from somebody who spends more time on offsiders and not enough on insiders, but if we've got such a strong economy, why aren't we getting better returns? Annette?
It's a very good question, actually. Look, I think part of the problem is, Barry referred to this, a lot of the decisions made by super funds were made looking backwards at the history and what sorts of returns have historically been provided. And we went through that glory period through the 80s and 90s where interest rates were going down, and it seemed that markets were going to go up forever. So I think there is a question of whether or not super funds have just been putting too much money into risky assets like the share market without necessarily realising the underlying risks of those things. I know whenever I talk to members, super funds talk about volatility and all sorts of things. The members are always telling me, and I'm sure they tell all the people in the audience here too, they hate seeing their money go backwards. And if we look at the GFC, which everyone thinks is now over, I think at the end of February, the returns were showing that we were still about 5% off the high that we hit before the GFC. So it takes an awful long time to get that money back. So I think there are all those sorts of issues. I think funds do need to look a lot more at managing risks.
Or move to the United States. I mean, that's where, the share market there is, there is a lot of money in cash at the moment still, from what I can tell, in super funds, in balanced funds, but they're geared more to the share market. And the Australian share market, and this is what we have to face over the next year or so at least, is lagging behind other global markets. And that you ask about the economy, it's just to do with the nature of our economy. We've got higher interest rates, the dollar's shot up. The prospects for growth are already sort of factored in, whereas in the US they're just starting to zoom out of recession. So, I mean, the sad reality is around today, you know, we're basically back to where we were in terms of the share market index at the beginning of the year, and the US is up about 5%. And that's where Australia is going to be for a while, particularly as people are getting more concerned about what will happen in China and with their credit tightening, and our fortunes are hitched to China.
Unfortunately, Barry, there's no correlation between the performance of our economy and the performance of that country's share market.
Share market's about 6 months ahead, I think, yeah.
All right, let's see if we can make this system work. What is the idea there? We slow that down so that we can focus on one of the questions. What?
I don't understand that one.
I don't get that one. All right, are we supporting big bank profits by directing SG... See, a lot of this is in...
Jargon.
I think we better spell out...
Super guaranteed contributions.
To the contribution to super rather than to one's mortgage. So are we supporting the big bank profits by doing that?
I don't see how, really. And also the fact is the bank's profits will be lower because of all the reforms that have come in. They're probably going to... Their return on assets is actually going to be tougher. Return on equity is going to be tougher in the years ahead, and that's where a lot of people have placed their their investments in. So I don't think it's actually a good thing for the super industry in general to complain about bank industry profits.
Well, not in terms of savings and deposits, which are taxed at your marginal rate of tax. Super, of course, isn't, and the banking industry would like to, and the Henry Tax Review, which could be something that comes up in the October tax summit, which we haven't talked about, are pushing for concessions on savings, not so that they've got a bit more reliable source of funding for the banks, and that would also hit super.
But by the way, I don't think they are going to do anything on savings because it would be too costly, and actually the banks have been more successful in getting money into deposits because they've been offering higher deposit rates, and because of, as Cheryl mentioned, also there is this emphasis on in Australia in focusing on equities in investments, and maybe for a lot of people, particularly as they get older, particularly as they see what happened in the last few years, they're not that interested in doing it, so they actually quite like the idea of safety.
There's another question here. Does the opposition have any genuine super policies other than running interference? Their basic objection to the 12%, if there is one, is just on timing at this stage, isn't it? They're kind of keeping their options open. Oh,
actually, I think they've been very poor on superannuation. I mean, I think that the one of the things that you could be most critical of the Howard government about, and then continuing in terms of the Liberals this time, is they've never really thought that much ahead about super. We had the Peter Costello, you can all put $1 million into super, which was ridiculous, and then it happened just ahead of the GFC anyway, so that wasn't kind of very smart. I did think that the government's changes on the limits that people could put into superannuation, I think that's been a really bad idea, but they're going to continue that. But in terms of the Liberals, I think they're not thinking ahead, they're not doing this well, and I wouldn't have any faith in what they're going to do on superannuation.
Is this because they haven't? It's because it's a Labor Party policy, in terms of compulsory super, that they've never been able to kind of, commit to it. I mean, who is the federal opposition person on super?
Matthias Cormann, and their policy, which was put out about 2 days before the last federal election, was literally one page that said, we won't support this, we won't support that, and we'll talk about things.
They made 4 pages out of it with a bit of flim-flam, I think. It was basically a one-page policy.
And have any focus groups been formed to gauge the rise in compulsory super with the Gen Y group, and what story does it tell? Probably not. I doubt that any focus groups have been done specifically with Gen Y, but Annette, getting Gen Y to focus on it probably is a big ask.
Look, it is. That's the generation that is struggling with the problem of how to buy their first home. And given housing affordability, that's always going to be a bigger issue than super. Super becomes more of an issue when you're approaching retirement, probably around 40 or 50, and you can see yourself stopping work one day. But there hasn't been any research that says Gen Y is anti-super, which is a positive. They just don't see it as being terribly relevant yet.
I can't see from the lights whether there are microphones going around, but are there? Has anybody got a question that they want to do via the microphone, or will we continue with the text questions? Here's one.
Hi there, Colin Tate from Connexus Financial. Panel, can you let us know what do you think it would take to have superannuation make it onto the front page of the Herald Sun or the Telegraph to actually mainstream this issue and get the regular population interested in their superannuation?
Well, Barry, you should take that, because Barry works with the Financial Review now, but he's worked with just about every newspaper in the country, including the Argus, would you believe? So how would you do it?
It's hard to get on the front page of the Argus, I can guarantee you. I can't imagine any... it's very hard to imagine a story which would get superannuation on the front page of the Herald Sun, nor indeed would the industry want it on it, I think. Yes. But, you know, I mean, it's just a convenient way of saying that you've got to get superannuation talked about by the ordinary person. I would have thought it would be more important to get superannuation talked about on Facebook or Twitter, or run it as a plot line in Home and Away or Neighbours than trying to get it onto the front page of a tabloid newspaper.
Does the panel support a mandated allocation to nation building as a condition of an extra 3%? I suppose that's kind of dovetails into what the government's saying about infrastructure spending, but what about that as a concept?
Well, I think that's a hard one, and people will really react against it because they don't, and particularly the superannuation industry. But I think that's one of the more interesting aspects. I mean, everybody says, oh, you know, we need money for for infrastructure, and superannuation money would be really good for, and that would work well. I don't think we've had much attention paid to how that would be attractive to superannuation. And the fact is, of course, superannuation tends to want steady investments. They don't want to invest in, in new greenfield developments. They prefer ones with steady established cash flow. So I think there would be some way of, making kind of bonds more attractive, infrastructure bonds, making it more attractive for the superannuation industry to invest. That would actually, of course, cost the government as well in terms of further concessions. But I think that's by far the better idea. And again, I come back to this point, an issue like the carbon tax is leaching so much of this debate or so much of the energy away. We're not going to look at things like that, which will be very, very important in the long term for the economy as well as for everybody's superannuation and the industry.
Yeah, I mean, the government has basically pushed back all the time and said we're not going to push super funds to invest in infrastructure, but at the same time, it's also done nothing to make it easier for the superannuation or investment industry to develop investment vehicles for people to be able to invest in infrastructure. So the government has really got to do something other than just run away from the question.
The good news is, I think, Bill Shorten, as the Financial Services Minister, will be trying to make a name for himself and actually get some reform. So he would be interested. I mean, I think he's more attuned than many people with what the needs of the industry are, what makes it attractive for people to invest. So I think he's a good person, in that sense, to be the minister in charge. The question is whether he will be given the opportunity to work on issues like that.
If Greg Combo has a win on the carbon tax, I'd suggest Bill Shorten would be very anxious to get some runs on the board on superannuation. What other alternatives are there to offset super contributions through wages? I seem to recall Gruen saying some time ago that one other way of doing it is just gradually, incrementally mandating salary sacrifice, 1% and then 2% and so on. But are there other ways of doing it?
One of the ones that's been explored a lot, and this government really hasn't shown any interest in it, is soft compulsion, where it's voluntary it's contributions by the employee, and they can choose to opt out of it if they don't want to do it. Otherwise, it happens automatically. I think we're also forgetting that the Henry Review didn't actually recommend moving to 12%. It said there were other ways of getting the same results, such as reducing super taxes. I know the opposition was interested in exploring that. Whether it was just, as I think someone said, to oppose what the government was doing, I don't know. But there are other alternatives out there. I think the reason the government went for 12% was because it was very simple.
Okay, question up here, number 10. Oh, I can see the numbers now.
Pauline Vamos, CEO of ASFA. I have a question in terms of what you see the stories are over the next 6 months in the super industry. You're all esteemed reporters, you all write good copy. Where do you hope or where do you think the stories are around super?
Okay, Annette, you're writing on it all the time.
Yes, it is.
Look, I'm still following the legislative process. There has been so much happening, and the fallout of that is just going to be a big story for at least the next year. I think investments also still have the potential. Actually, that's one thing that could end up on the front page of the papers. There are still a lot of risks out there in the markets. I think another fall in super fund returns could have you wishing that you weren't on the front page of the Herald Sun. But look, there aren't any other real areas. It's really those sort of legislative reforms, where they go, and how super funds do get their investment credibility back.
I think assuming that there's no big disaster in the markets, which that is actually obviously everything will be focused on that, and that continues to be a risk. But clearly the government's reforms around super and how that actually works, and the ending of commissions, of this obviously more interest to the for-profit sector and stuff. But of course, don't forget that the commissions will still apply to all the products that they already have, the clients that they already have. So I think those types of stories, and whether or not the streamlining of super really works, if people's fees go down, those types of things may not be dramatic, but they'll actually be quite significant, and I think will continue to be quite a big story over the year.
All that issue of presenting a united front. I mean, I know you talk about the traditional splits, but I think the former Super Minister Chris Bowen was always saying that the only way he got the 12% through Cabinet was to convince them that the trade-off, it's not just wage trade-offs, but trade-off with the industry. We're going to turbocharge your business. We want something back in terms of better transparency, efficiency, certainly on fees and charges.
Number 2, and that might have to be the last question, I think.
About insiders and that film Inside Job, to me, that's a question that really, for a lot of individuals, are saying, well, there's so many crooks who've stolen their money in this sort of industry. Joseph Jukes, for example, is still at large, has not been put in prison. All those, Wall Street investment banks that really did some terrible things to investors' money. Isn't that the real elephant in the room that is preventing people from sort of getting too excited about adding another 3% to their super?
Yeah, maybe that's so, but I mean, one of the polls I saw was 60% in support of the compulsory superannuation, but 34% thought they're not getting. Only 34% thought they were getting a good deal. But is that part of the problem?
Well, I do think it's part of the problem, and everyone says, oh well, the excesses in Australia weren't nearly as bad as the excesses in the US. But that film Inside Job, which I recommend, is a very good story. It's a very good film. I mean, the point is, this industry, and obviously not so much in the not-for-profit sector, but there's obviously been, a bit of overlap here. There's so many bad stories that people have. They paid commissions, or they paid, financial advisors who didn't have nearly enough, training, and put them in the wrong things. And people are just very disillusioned, I think, and I think it's going to take a long time. And then plus they see, not necessarily your fault, but they see very high wages being paid in the financial service sector, and they think, well, somehow I'm getting ripped off. This isn't working for me. So I do think there is that general suspicion that you have to be aware of, and that's where I think, in a sense, the not-for-profit sector has a big advantage. The question is if they can be as nimble and as agile as they should be in terms of developing the products that people want.
Yeah, but I think we should remember that the Australian superannuation industry as a whole basically was pretty vigilant and did not get caught up in very much of the problems that some of the Americans were. I mean, we've sailed through this, and it's partly because of our regulators, partly because of the banking system, and partly because of the system of trustees who have been pretty vigilant and have not been caught up in this.